welcome Francis Dearnley to the stage.
My background when I was studying history, I did the two extremes. So I did a lot of ancient history, and then I did post-Napoleon to the present day in Europe. So when I look at history, I tend to look at it in terms of what are the lessons that are applicable from across human societies.
Thank you for being here today with us, finding time, bringing the messages across, and for your podcast, for really raising this awareness, for speaking up the truth about Ukraine. Because when it sounds, when it comes out from you, it's much more powerful when we Ukrainians speak about Ukraine.
Hi everyone. Today St. Maurice is happy to host the brilliant journalist and the host of one of the most famous podcasts. Dmytro Soroka will ask questions and lead this conversation. I wanted to say why I invited Francis. I met him at the brilliant screening of a Ukrainian documentary about medics at war, and after that there was QA session, and what he was saying was so aligned to what I think and what I feel that I couldn't believe that a person who is not Ukrainian has these thoughts and feelings, and I thought that you might be interested to listen to him as well and to know the story, the success of the podcast, and maybe have some insights for your future. So, thank you.
So we welcome Francis Dearnley to the stage. He's executive editor for audio projects, which basically means he's responsible for overseeing the production, strategy, and editorial material for Telegraph. Prior to working as journalist, he was the chief of staff to the chair of Prime Minister Policy Board at the House of Parliament in London, and he also studied history at Cambridge University. So he has a huge background in history.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. If it's all right with you, I'll stand up for the first sort of 10 or 15 minutes as I just talk to you a little bit, and then we'll sit back down. You've got some questions. I know that you'll steer, and then I can take us. But I'd rather speak and look at you rather than be sat down. I haven't prepared anything specific because I know that the most helpful thing I think I can do is answer your questions, whether it be about the war, whether it be about my career, whether it be about Britain's approach to politics at the moment. Whatever you ask, I'm an open book and I'm very happy to answer your questions. But a little bit more about me. So my background is, as you say, I'm passionate about history. When I was studying, I was never somebody who was an all-rounder. So I'm not one of those students who was brilliant at mathematics, brilliant at science, brilliant at everything. I had lots of friends who were, but I was not that person. I was somebody who always was very specific and passionate about very few subjects: literature, English, and history, namely, and politics. And so for me, leaving GCSEs behind was an immense relief. I couldn't wait. And I loved getting into A-levels, and I loved even more the idea of going to university. So I only mention that, a bit of a perhaps strange way to start, but nobody ever said that to me when I was growing up. Everybody was always like, no, you really need to try and be an all-rounder, and you never know. But actually, I think that we're entering a world now where having specialties, having passion, is the most important thing that can set you apart. Now, I was very lucky. I worked hard during my A-levels, and I really found myself at that time because I hadn't, as I say, I wasn't an all-rounder in GCSEs, and I struggled in certain subjects. But once I was able and free to do to do the subjects that I was most passionate about, I felt liberated. And I was able to do well enough, and I was very lucky to study history at Cambridge. And I'm very happy to answer any questions about what that was like and the experience of applying there. I'm sure some of you are thinking about that yourselves. And I was studying European history. And at that time, I really thought that European history was something to really be seen of as the way things were in the past and would never be again. The wars, the First World War, the Second World War, the horrors of the collapse of Yugoslavia, the experience, of course, that Ukraine endured in the 20th century, that this would be something that would be consigned to the history books and would remain there just being studied. I never once thought over that time that I would then one day be reporting on a new war on European soil. And not just that, the bloodiest that we have seen and the most horrific that we have seen since 1945. But I didn't ever want to be a journalist. I wanted originally to be an academic. I wanted to study history. I wanted to write history books. But I found that academia wouldn't be for me because of the amount of time it would take to get new degrees and to work up and climb. And I wanted to do things. I wanted to be proactive about the things that I cared most about. And I did various different types of jobs. I did a bit of consulting. I did a bit of work in academia. And then I decided that I'd like to do some work in Parliament, in the Houses of Parliament. And I applied to work for my local MP. And there's another piece of advice I would give you is, I just wrote him a letter. Okay, I just wrote a letter and I said, I would like to do some work experience with you, please. Would that be something that you'd be open to? And he said, yeah, sure. And it just so happened that the 2 weeks that I was meant to be working for him happened to be over and after the Brexit referendum. So I was really thrown in to witnessing what was considered at the time the most important historical event, probably politically in Britain, of my lifetime. So of course, this was before the pandemic, before the war. But at the time, that was the perception. So I felt in a very privileged position as somebody passionate about history and seeing events unfolding in real time that people will be writing about in 50 and 100 years. I felt immensely privileged to be there, and I worked there for 3.5 years. I started as an intern, and then I rose up in about a couple of years to be Chief of Staff, which is running an MP's office. He happened to be in the government at the time, and he had an office in number 10 Downing Street. So I had a lot of insight into what was going on, the big conversations that were taking place in Downing Street. This is before Boris Johnson, but during the Theresa May era, the David Cameron era. But I can talk about meeting Boris, and I interviewed him a few weeks ago later on. But I did that for 3.5 years, but I felt still that it wasn't really something that I wanted to do just as a career path. I wanted to do something else. And a friend just said to me, have you ever considered doing journalism? Have you ever considered writing journalism? Have you ever considered doing reporting? And I hadn't really. I'd always thought that it was something for, a kind of person that I wasn't. But I thought, no, I'll give it a go. And I started a role working in commissioning opinion pieces on politics, on foreign affairs at the Telegraph newspaper. And then within 3 months, the war began. So my life changed as all of your lives changed, as so many millions of other lives changed on that date, and everything that's happened since. And it was the foresight of my late colleague David Knowles, who tapped me on the shoulder and some others at the paper and said, we need to record something now. This is on the date of the full-scale invasion. We need to record something now to mark what has occurred in the horror and what this means, because people are scared and people want to know what's going on. So we recorded something, an hour, a piece of analysis. It was just meant to be for that day. And then we thought, well, maybe there was quite an audience for it. Maybe we should do one more and one more and one more. And then before we knew it, we'd done the whole of the first week. Then we'd done the whole of the second week. And then now we've reported for an hour every single weekday for the entire duration of the war. There are very few figures in the Ukrainian government, in the British government, on and off the record that we haven't spoken to. I've met Zelensky, I've met Podolyak, I've met Budanov. I've had a lot of interactions with these people, and I'm very happy to answer your questions if you have any about those circumstances. We've also been to, of course, Ukraine many times. Of course, going to Kyiv the first time was a humbling experience and something that it's one thing to be reporting on the war from afar, but of course, as I'm sure many of you know, it's a very different experience to actually be there and to see the consequences of what you're reporting in real time. My last trip to Ukraine was to Kharkiv. I was there in early December. As you'll, I'm sure, be aware, Kharkiv is very much a frontline city. So is Kyiv, of course. I don't wish to downplay that, but Kharkiv is different. And I'm sure that many of you have relatives there who can describe to you how frequent the bombardments are. Every 3 or 4 hours, the air raid sirens go off, you hear the explosions, and it's an absolutely inspiring place to visit when you see the resilience of people who have gone through this now with real danger to their lives and to the prospect that their city might fall because it's been attacked through major invasions more than once, and still have humor, still have the ability to carry on and to treat you in a way that as if you're in their home but the air raid siren isn't going off. It's an amazing thing, and it is a privilege to have reported on this war and to have met so many people who I never hoped to meet, in the sense that I never hoped that we would have to see people tested through these most horrific of circumstances. And yet it is inspiring to see people and what they will endure and do for their fellow countrymen and women. Another subject that I'm very passionate about and have done a lot of work on is, well, two really, which I think sets our work apart from just the frequency in which we've been reporting on the war and the in-depth interviews that we do with key players. One is resistance in the occupied territories. I, as I'm sure many of you, am immensely frustrated, angry, and sometimes upset by the reporting around the occupied territories. There is an assumption, I think, that once territory is taken, whether it be a mile here, a mile there, or a dozen miles, that it's lost forever, that the people just give up and become Russian. And I've interviewed people who fled the occupied territories, who lived under occupation, who describe to you the horrific circumstances that they have endured, but also the acts of resistance that are taking place every single day against the occupiers. And so on the podcast recently, we've started doing a regular fortnightly segment where we have an amazing academic called Dr. Jade McGlynn, who's out in the field working with people who are very connected to the occupied resistance movements. And we report on what's happened in the last fortnight in terms of resistance activities, whether it be small acts, people refusing to change passports, refusing to speak the language that they're being encouraged to speak in public institutions, to assassinations. So I think that's something that is a subject I'm very happy to talk about on top of the reporting. And if I had one example of, I think, the ways in which sometimes journalism has not done enough, I'd say focusing on the occupied territories and naive assumptions about that. And of course that filters through to the way politicians talk and think about it as well. Another subject I'm very particularly passionate about is the kidnapped children. Many of you will know, of course, about the fact that there's this figure that's used, 19,000 children taken. That figure hasn't been updated for probably 18 months or longer now. And I think there are multiple reasons for that, but the biggest one is that we just don't have the data. And I think that when the full facts come to light, which they will and are, and we've, as many others have tried to raise awareness of these incidents, when the history books are written, the absolute horror of what has taken place and the fact that so many people were willing to turn a blind eye to it will shame many people in Europe and particularly in the United States. So sorry, those are two rather morbid subjects of focus, but I also should say that as a journalist, I'm also involved in covering other incidents as well. Ukraine is now my particular focus, but it's not all darkness. There are many incredible opportunities that I've had through my work over these last few years, and I say I've probably one of the most extraordinary was about a couple of weeks ago. Was it a couple of weeks ago or was it 3 weeks ago? Time is difficult to measure. I think it was about 3 weeks ago. I got a call from a contact of mine at the Ukrainian embassy who said that, would you like to come to Stansted Airport? There's going to be a press conference after President Zelensky had met the king. And I said, certainly. And I assumed it would be a big media scrum, which is what they usually are. You know, you'd imagine you've got the world press there, and they're all flashing cameras and everything. And then it turned out when we arrived that actually there were only about 7 or 8 of us with the president for an hour and 40 minutes, asking questions on and off the record. That was quite an extraordinary experience. And this was only 48 hours after that encounter in the White House with President Trump. And we asked him about that. I asked him about the occupied territories. I asked him about his future plans for the war. And if you're interested, I can tell you some of the things that he said. So that's a little bit of an overview of some of the things that we're involved in. And as I say, I'm very happy to comment on anything, really, that you would find interesting, whether it be about being a journalist, whether it be about questions relating to the war and the way it's developed over the last 3 years, where we might be in a few months' time, interviews that I've done, we've done with big players. I'm very happy to talk about any of that. But I should just say, thank you all very much for having me. It has been the privilege of my life to report on this war and to report on the most extraordinary country and people, one which people in this country really didn't have the knowledge of before the war. And if there is one positive that comes out of this horrific experience, it is that everybody knows about Ukraine now and sees Ukraine as part of the family of democratic nations in Europe. And I believe that whatever darkness awaits us over the coming weeks, months, who knows, maybe years, that Putin has lost this war, fundamentally, in terms of his core objectives. And I think that Ukraine's future is as a part of Europe, and I think that whatever happens over the next few months, that is not going to change. So, I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have, but that's a little bit about me. I know I sound very morose. I sound very depressing. I should say I'm not a very miserable, depressing person. I'm an optimist by nature. Okay, so but obviously when you're talking about war, this is something that you all know a lot about, and I don't want to be seen here smiling and things, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have, but I know I'm imagine you've got some to kick us off.
So, in your opinion, what lesson should the world leaders learn from the war in Ukraine?
The war leaders or the current leaders,
Yeah.
prime ministers and things? I think, on the one hand, I would say that there is a real lesson that we've all seen of the importance of courage and the importance that certain individuals in the right place at the right time can have on events. When I was growing up, there was always this idea that you as an individual, you don't really matter in the grand sweep of history. You know, that we're all just products of these big tidal forces and we just happen to be swept along. And, you know, maybe you might do something of value, but really it's all about the big institutions now, whether it be NATO, the UN, the European Union. You know, part of what happened in the 20th century is that, and I was speaking to Dmytro Kuleba, the former foreign minister of Ukraine, about this, and he said a really good point, which he said that people say, where is Churchill now? What we forget is that after the horrors of the Second World War, we tried to make a world where you didn't have these really powerful leaders. So we tried to look for institutions instead. And of course, now what we're seeing is that maybe these institutions themselves are weak, and so we're looking again to the individuals who really matter. And I think President Zelensky is one of those who made decisions that have changed history. And I think that more leaders in Europe and in the world should follow his example of following principle and willing to sometimes say the uncomfortable truth and be consistent in that. But many, many leaders would never thought it possible that we would be seeing what we're seeing now. And I think that's the other thing, is just remember that this is an experience that should not have been allowed to happen, and they've got to learn the lessons from that.
Is there maybe a particular historical event or figure that has influenced your perspective on journalism?
My background when I was studying history, I did the two extremes. So I did a lot of ancient history, and then I did post-Napoleon to the present day in Europe. So when I look at history, I tend to look at it in terms of what are the lessons that are applicable from across human societies. So it's less about individuals for me sometimes, although of course, as I was just saying, individuals can matter immensely, such as President Zelensky and obviously the leadership of Boris Johnson, who did play a pivotal role in shaming Europe into action. But in terms of my approach to journalism, I think that the work of journalists is often underappreciated in the sense that we are trying to write the first draft of history. And I think there are so many different types of journalists that, of course, can sometimes give other journalists perhaps a bad name. But fundamentally, if you look at the work of journalists throughout the decades who have exposed scandals, who have fought for values by raising awareness of some of the stories I was just talking about, whether it be in the occupied territories, whether it be the horrors of kidnapped children. Without journalists really drawing a spotlight onto these issues, politicians wouldn't know about them. And they're the ones who are then making the decisions that impact all of us. As I say, I'm lucky and fortunate in that I worked up close in Westminster, and I saw how decisions are made. I used to really believe that there were a group of people at the top of society who knew better than everybody else. They were smarter, they were better looking, they were better dressed, they had more money. And I thought, all I can do is sort of be on the periphery of these geniuses. And let me tell you, when you actually see these people up close, you realize that they're just like you and me. And that is terrifying, but also liberating. And as I say, you see how they make decisions. The process is, I've just got to get through this day. I've got to get through this week. Oh, what's that over there? Yeah, okay, that's a crisis I need to solve. What's this thing? Yeah, okay, fine. They are not, as they should be, perhaps, they are not reading in detail everything that's written on the subjects of the day. So the work of journalists is to try and condense that and raise awareness of the issues so that those who are making decisions actually know what's going on. So I think journalists do have a vital role, and I've been inspired by countless generations of journalists who've done just that, but it's an invisible job in many ways. It's often an invisible job.
So kind of a hard question. What's the most challenging story you had to encounter while doing the podcast?
I'll be honest, the most difficult story I've covered was the death of my colleague on the podcast, David Knowles. So David Knowles created the podcast, I mentioned him earlier on, and my colleague Dom Nichols and I and him were the trio reporting on this with our colleagues at the Telegraph, but we were the core trio. And he passed away in September last year of a sudden cardiac arrest. And none of us saw it coming. It was a complete shock. But reporting that as a journalist, working on writing, drafting the obituary of somebody that you spoke to 24 hours before, is a difficult experience. I also knew and was very sensitive to the fact that doing a podcast is a very intimate experience. I don't know how many of you listen to podcasts, but listening to one is a very intimate experience. You get to know the voices. And so we had to tell listeners this news. And this is people who came to know him in Ukraine, came to know him in America. I mean, every day the podcast gets around, it varies, but I'd say probably an average of between 100 and 150,000 downloads. And we've had 100 million downloads over the course of the war. So it's a very, very big audience. And reporting that was very difficult. In terms of Ukraine stories, I think the most challenging for me was when I was interviewing families who had fled the occupied territories, that they lived under occupation, hearing the testimony from them verbatim about being beaten by Russian soldiers, about the death of their neighbors. Some of the stories I won't repeat here, but just really, really difficult subject matter. And you're very aware that you're having to report this in a way that is sensitive to them, but it's a painful experience. And you're asking somebody to resurrect their most powerful painful memories. And that's not something that is a pleasurable thing to do. So I would say that those would be two examples that come to mind.
So you visited Ukraine a couple of times. What was the thing you liked most about Ukraine?
Oh, gosh. Yes, I've been to Ukraine quite a few times now over the course of the war. I would say, as I mentioned earlier on, I think the resilience is the most extraordinary thing. I think I find that extremely inspiring, and how welcoming people are. I also find as well that just the beauty of the cities is so vastly underappreciated. I mean, even Kharkiv, which I think sometimes gets a bit of a bad rep architecturally, I found a really interesting city because of its history and its literary heritage and everything like that. So as a historian, of course, I got very excited about that. But I think for me, the main takeaway is just the extraordinary everyday heroism that you see of people who are just carrying on with their lives, carrying on with trying to support each other. And it is amazing seeing a society that can function in that way in the most difficult circumstances.
Kind of a traditional question. What advice would you give to your teenage self?
Worry less. As I mentioned at the beginning, I didn't have any real grand plan when I was your age, but I was fortunate in that I knew what I was passionate about. And find what you're passionate about and work with that, I would say. One of the biggest lessons I've learned over the course of my life, I'm 32, so I'm not saying to be an expert here, okay? I'm still young like you. I remember going to school. I'm not an ancient person. I wish I'd known this earlier. So this is my big piece of advice. Identify those things that make you exceptional, that make you different. So it may well be that you're a brilliant illustrator or artist. It may be that you're a brilliant public speaker. It may be you're a brilliant linguist. It may be that you're a brilliant writer. Whatever. Maybe you're a brilliant engineer, scientist. But don't just find that one thing. Find those combinations of things and then try and find a career that fits that. Because the way to really, I think, be fulfilled and the way to be able to perhaps achieve as much as you might like to in your life is to find that combination of things that make you different, focus in on those, and find a career where you are the only person who, or statistically, who has the likelihood of, or the chance of all of those different elements working together, and nobody will be able to challenge you. You know, you'll be unique. So there are many, many brilliant writers, but there are also fewer writers who can also talk about their work in a way that people would want to listen. So I'm using that as another example of where if you can find those combinations of things, then that's a helpful way. But passion is also very important. It's the only thing that will keep you motivated at the end of the day, because life is hard, okay? I also think, I wish people had told me that life gets hard. Enjoy your youth.
Okay, we've got about 15 minutes left. Maybe, are there any questions in the audience?
So I've got two quick questions. First of all, before the war started in 2022, what was your knowledge of Ukraine like? Did you know a lot already, or were you coming in relatively ignorant? And secondly, are there any periods, events, or people from Ukrainian history that really interest or inspire you, or if not, in general, just world history?
That's a great question. So my knowledge of Ukraine, I'll be honest, because of the particular historical periods I was focused on, much of my knowledge of Ukraine was shaped by the Second World War and the Cold War. So naturally, pre-independence. But that has been actually very valuable for covering this war, because it means that you're able to quash a lot of the Russian narratives about the conflict. Russia likes to claim that it was the victim of the Nazis, that it was Russia that bore the brunt of Operation Barbarossa and the invasion. But actually, it was Ukraine that bore that brunt. It was the most of the battlefields where the most important battles took place were on Ukrainian soil. And statistically, Ukraine's population, civilian population, soldiers, lost far, far more in statistical terms than the Russians did. So really, it's Ukraine which should see itself as being the number one victims of the Nazis before you even get into the Soviet horrors, like the Holodomor. So much of my understanding came from that, but it's been quite insightful, I think, for re-evaluating Ukraine and its place in history, for that background. In terms of figures I admire from history, I'll give you one modern example just because I find the story so extraordinary. Cold War, you've got, of course, many countries behind the Iron Curtain. I'm quite interested in Czechia, Czech Republic. And you basically had a lot of dissident intellectuals, musicians, artists who were still operating secretly, like people now are in the occupied territories of Ukraine. We're working against the Russian authorities, as we're writing music, writing protest songs, writing poetry, meeting together, talking about forbidden ideas. And many of them were very, very bright people, very clever people, but they were forced by the Russians to work as laborers. And then when the Iron Curtain came crashing down, Václav Havel, who was one of these dissidents, great believer in democracy, had been a dissident against everything that the Russians have been trying to impose on Czechia, or Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, actually, as it was then, became president overnight. And I find that story just absolutely incredible. That you can go from being somebody who was totally, literally spent time in prison, was constantly having his house raided, but it never broke his spirit. And then, before you know it, he's president of the country, and he's forging its democratic future. And there are two lessons I take from that. One, the importance of never having your spirit broken, because you never know when, two, the tide of history can change. and it can change very quickly. Right now, we all feel like nothing can change in the circumstances that we're in. You know, that this is looking very attritional, that, you know, Putin might be there for the next 20 years. When things change, they change very, very quickly in history. Sometimes days, sometimes hours. So I see his story as being quite an example of that.
I have a question. What do you think, how does the war in Ukraine now affecting politics, and what is the future of Ukraine, Britain, and Europe as a whole in the future?
I think it's changed everything. And I think it's very unfortunate, very, very unfortunate, that it's taken the horrific events that we've seen in the last few weeks involving Donald Trump and his attitudes towards NATO, towards his European allies, to realize that what should have been obvious from day one, which is that Europe has a responsibility to protect Ukraine, not only because it's at the forefront of democracy's fight and the values that we're all supposedly meant to be upholding, but also for Europe's future, for Europe's security. So I think that this war has changed everything, because now you're seeing politicians talking about things that would have been inconceivable only months ago. Having troops on the ground in Ukraine, British troops, French troops, German troops, my God. I mean, the Germans never want to do anything that involves military affairs. Even they're talking about mobilizing now. So it's totally, totally transformed politics. And I think that it's only going to get even more so over the months ahead.
On Thursday, we had a meeting at the embassy. A few of us with Deputy Foreign Minister talking about children that have gone missing, have been kidnapped. That's one topic you could probably do, but also one topic which is coming up is 80 years of VE Day in Europe. Now, Ukraine during the Second World War is a very complicated country, very complicated matter regarding who fought, who didn't fight, on what side people fought. And I think it will be a very good idea to give a perspective, especially as Putin uses this continuously, about Nazis, denazification, etc., that for you to do a podcast about that. We could get, we know historians in Canada and Ukraine could help you with this. And I think this is very important, especially with Putin will use the 8th and 9th of May as a propaganda tool on a big, big way.
Yes, I think it's a really important date. We will be doing something on it. I don't know what yet. I mean, I was, just to give you a sense of how much the United States has changed in the last few months in its attitudes towards Ukraine. I was at the D-Day 80th anniversary last year where President Biden spoke. And President Biden said, that what our American soldiers did on the fields of Normandy in liberating Europe, those values are now being fought for in Ukraine. He said that at a big historical moment. You would never hear Donald Trump saying that. And so I think it's very important, and that's certainly something we've tried to do on Ukraine the Latest. It's very important to remind Americans that, their fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers shed their blood for these values that are being now defended. And I think they know that deep down, but they've gone down a very strange warped road at the moment, and we need to help bring them back.
So what changes do you think are needed in order to improve how the world perceives and understands information about Ukraine and the current events that are happening? Thanks.
Thank you. I think the most important thing is to encourage people to be informed and to use reliable sources. I mean, obviously I'm biased. I would say that we have a very good, reliable source that one can listen to every day. But I think that, broadly speaking, there is something deeper going on at the moment, which is, of course, on social media. I'm a great believer that the medium is the message. So what I mean by that is I could write something on social media that is a really detailed, nuanced take on an issue relating to Ukraine and the war. I would struggle, but let's say I did one and it was like 500 characters or something, I can make a really strong point. I know for a fact that that is not going to do as well and be as widely shared and circulated as something where I literally, or somebody else, just says something that's simply not true, inaccurate information. So we've got to be very careful about social media and understanding what's being put in front of us, because the algorithms are putting things in front of us which are not necessarily accurate, because that's not what their objective is. Their objective is to make you like it or swipe it or have a reaction to it. It's essentially sensationalist. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't immense value in social media. I've got many sources, many contacts, many things I learn about what's going on in the world I get from X. So I'm not saying this as somebody who's saying that social media should be stopped, it's terrible, it's destroying our minds or anything like that. But I would say that everybody needs to be careful, and we need to be better informed about the way in which those platforms are being deliberately manipulated by Russia and by other actors like China, to shape our minds and to shape our understandings of events, of what is happening in Ukraine. So it's very important that I think we make more people aware of that, and to promote reliable sources and to challenge disinformation narratives when they emerge.
So how do you think the Ukrainian identity will change after the war?
After the war? Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, you would probably have a much better idea than myself as to what is likely to change. I think, of course, fundamentally, it will depend on what happens, how the war ends. I think that there will be, if the war is able to end with a security guarantee in place, which means a lasting peace is possible, and people believe that if they go home, that it will be a safe country and that it will be rebuilding and that it will be part of Europe in a sense, and it will be part of having lots of investment and lots of people going to the country, then I think that Ukrainian identity there'll be more people who will go home, and at least the mentality will be like, well, we're now part of this European family in a proper, real way that we can measure in terms of seeing the investment and seeing that transformation. Because I'm absolutely certain that if the war were to end with a security guarantee that people perceived as lasting, that Ukraine would see a massive revival and renaissance economically, culturally, in all of these different ways. The more pessimistic take would be that if Europe proves itself incapable of supporting Ukraine and essentially betrays the country, then of course, I think that there's every reason to think that Ukrainians themselves will feel betrayed, and their attitudes will shift, not only towards the United States, but towards Europeans. And that would be on us, because I wouldn't blame you, frankly. So I think that we just do not know. It depends on how this war ends, but that is in our hands.
Thank you. I have a question as well. Can you please tell us more how AI helps you to translate your podcast into Ukrainian and Russian, and how do you find your voice sounding in Ukrainian?
Well, thank you for reminding me. Yes, so I should say that for the 3rd anniversary, a few weeks ago, we launched a Ukrainian translated version of the podcast each day, and we've continued to keep publishing it. So you can listen to the podcast, not always necessarily all of the interviews, it's not always necessarily always the full interview, but in terms of the core reporting, you can listen to it in Ukrainian every day, every weekday, hearing still my voice. And the way we've made that work is with AI, advanced AI. So basically what happens is we take the audio, we put it into a machine, the machine keeps our voices, but translates it into Ukrainian or any other language that you so wish, but obviously we wanted to do it in Ukrainian as one of the languages. And then we have somebody who's a native speaker to check the transcript of what the AI has done, and then they go through it. Usually takes an hour, a couple of hours, and then we publish. So you can actually listen to our work in Ukrainian or, in theory, other languages within a few hours of us actually recording it and not speaking any language fluently. So AI is transforming everything in terms of what is capable, technology is capable of doing, and I think it can have a positive impact in terms of breaking down certain barriers and access to information. I mean, I think Ukrainians have access to very good and accurate journalistic reporting. That's not the main reason why we did it, But other languages, Russian language, we also have a Russian language service of our work, and that has a very big audience in certain places. And I think that, you know, that's an example of where without AI, we wouldn't be able to make that reporting accessible to people who are Russian speakers in Russia, or indeed Russian speakers in Ukraine, or in Eastern Europe for whom Russian was a second language because of the Soviet legacy. So AI is having a lot of positive impacts, I think, but also it's, of course, something that we should all be cautious of for obvious reasons too.
I have one more question about Russia. What do you think, does Russia possibly can change in the future? Because we in Ukraine assured Russia is going to be like now a dictatorship with no like human rights. And what do you think on that? And what does Western audience think about that? And how can journalists change minds of people in the West?
It's a great question. One of the biggest misconceptions of the war early on was about attitudes towards Russia. Many countries, I think Britain is less guilty of this, but many countries, particularly Germany, particularly France, I would say, have a very naive view of Russia and the idea of Russian imperialism. They fundamentally thought that Putin would never invade, that it was never conceivable that he would invade. And that was because they didn't really understand the reality and nature of modern Russia. I don't think we can afford to be optimistic about its future in terms of going down a more democratic path. I think the problem is that societies, once they become as fascistic as this, history would point to the fact that they become more bellicose, more dangerous, rather than less. And that's why, of course, Europe has to step up, because for its own security, it has to be thinking in terms of we need to arm here, because there's every chance that after Ukraine that they'll go for Estonia or wherever. So I think that it was definitely been very naive with regard to understanding Russia. One of the uncomfortable lessons of modern history is it's very, very difficult to profoundly change a society that is a dictatorship and is also obsessed with its own kind of conception of how things are without military occupation. So if you look at Nazi Germany, why does Germany change? It's because there are American, British, French troops rolling with tanks through the streets of Berlin. Why does Japan change? Japan is occupied after the Second World War. It totally changes. Now it's part of the family of nations, just as Germany is. Now, I don't think that that's going to happen with Russia for multiple reasons. One, the nuclear element most obviously, but also I think that I just don't think we're going to be in a situation, not in the short term, where there would ever be the political willpower in Europe to occupy Russia as part of a war. So that means that you have to try and find other ways to transform a society. And of course, one of the ways, which I've always felt, is you score a major military defeat, that it obliges the regime to be humbled, and that everybody can see in the country that what they were being told was untrue. Unfortunately, the attitude of many Western countries instead was, we don't really want there to be a military defeat for Russia. We want to put Ukraine and the West into the strongest possible negotiating position so that we can end this war through a negotiation rather than some kind of decisive military defeat. But I would argue that we should have pursued the idea of a decisive military defeat, and maybe we still can, because that would be the best outcome in terms of potentially changing Russia, maybe not getting rid of Putin, but at the very least making him humbled and not able to strike out and do those kind of invasions, military sabotage, whatever, again, hybrid warfare. But I think, again, it's keeping people informed and challenging things that are simply untrue and naive assumptions about what Russia is. Because there are many naive assumptions out there, as I'm sure you all know all too well.
What is your audience? I know that the podcast is being listened in almost every country of the world, but what is your audience? Do young people listen to the podcast? Do young people at all follow major media?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing about podcasts, is that they have a different audience than traditional newspapers might. So younger people do listen to far more podcasts than they would read newspapers. So we do have, I think, a younger demographic digesting the news via us than would through other forms. In terms of countries, we have 25% of our audience is from the UK, 30% is in the United States, I think another 5% is in Australia, and maybe another 3% in Canada, and then the rest is sort of Europe. And it's actually quite hard to break that down by country, but we have also obviously a lot of listeners in Ukraine as well. But it's a very much international audience, and I'm always like, we've got an inbox, and we get messages from some of the most random places. You know, like we've got some listeners in Brazil and Japan. And you sort of think, and they, you know, and they're like, they care deeply about Ukraine, and also Taiwan. Now, interestingly, Taiwan, okay, everybody is really worried about the idea of China invading Taiwan. I know people in Taiwan. You go there, contacts of mine. You say to them, "What's the number one thing that we, Britain, the West, could do for you to make you less concerned about an invasion?" And they will tell you, to a man, arm Ukraine. They know that if the outcome of this war is the idea of countries being rewarded for their imperialism, that they're next. At the end of the day, almost all of the post-Second World War architecture that we've lived through is designed on the idea that might is not right. That things such as sovereignty exist, that there are legal activities that, and this is so different from the majority of human history. You know, it just used to be for the majority of the centuries, if you're the most powerful, of course you have a right to have spheres of influence, to control other territories, have your own empires. We tried to build a better world, but there seems to be many, many people now who are very open to the idea, whether it be in the United States, whether it be in Russia, whether it be in China, that might is right. And if you really believe that, no one is safe.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but first of all, I'd just like to thank you, Francis, for just doing all of that. You're influencing Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine very deeply, and I think Ukrainians should express their deepest appreciation to you.
Thank you.
And I'll just take one more minute to really, say, I think support was being sent by all the young people and all the guests today. Huge thank you for being here today with us, finding time, bringing the messages across, and for your podcast, for really raising this awareness, for speaking up the truth about Ukraine, because when it sounds, when it comes out from you, it's much more powerful when we Ukrainians speak about Ukraine, because quite often the world takes it very subjective, despite the history, despite the current victims and all the suffering the Ukraine is going through, still we're being taken quite subjectively. So thank you for that work, because and also coming here today, I think what's important, speaking to Ukrainians, you give Ukrainians the voice. Speaking to the world, you help us fight that disinformation, and a lot has been mentioned today. So thank you that you run it so that it was inspirational for this slot, because we've mentioned quite a few times that while the leaders of the current world are making the right decisions, at the same time making mistakes, we are growing the leaders of the future who might think that might is right, or might think that we need to grow the democratic world. And they're being grown today in these discussions, because as you said, you will be those leaders on different levels, leading your passion, leading what you're good at, and you'll be leading people behind you. You'll be the leaders of that change. But that change can get for the democratic direction and can go in the opposite. So these talks are very important with the young people, with the youngsters, as early as possible. We talk a lot about disinformation today. Thank you for mentioning social media. We as educationists see how much is happening on TikTok. And just one more message to you lot. What we've noticed, many of you, knowing what's really happening in Ukraine, still scroll or sometimes watch all those silly videos of disinformation and propaganda. And when you stop and watch it, you add numbers to the video. So when the person who is not that knowledgeable sees the numbers, they trust. They think, okay, if another 100,000 watch this, I should watch it too. You encourage disinformation when you do stop on that TikTok video. You should be just scrolling. You should be just going through. So these are really important messages, really important thing. We say that Ukrainian children in such a way, but have been vaccinated against disinformation. But we now need to think together how we can vaccinate the world, and particularly UK, against the disinformation. Thank you once again.
Thank you everyone very much for having me. Thank you.